The Sound Off Podcast. The show about podcast and broadcast. Starts now.
This week it's the return of Ross on Radio. Now, forgive the not-so-subtle Star Wars reference here. It's been just over 3 years since Sean was on the show. About the same amount of time George Lucas would allocate to space out his Star Wars films. Sean is the author of the Ross on Radio newsletter. He's been working and consulting with radio stations across North America, and he works with Edison Research on various station projects. You can find him on the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, where he comments on music trends and identifies those moments of music scheduling bliss. Sean is one of the more popular guests, and by that, I mean whenever we ask people who should be on the show, Sean is one of the more common asks. And now, Sean Ross joins me from Maplewood, New Jersey. How have you been, Sean?
I'm okay.
I missed seeing you at Radio Days North America.
I was there.
I was there too.
You should have come to Jukebox Jury. You were probably in the PTM session.
You know, I find that there's a lot of choice and there's a lot of FOMO at these things now, and bad decisions get made.
Or it's better than the alternative, which is nothing to go to. But yeah, it's, more than a lot of other conventions.
And you and I were at the former Canadian Music Week, which was still coming out of the pandemic, but then the next year it became Radio Days North America. And I know you've been to a lot of these things. So how did it compare? How did it perform? And how much did you like it?
I was so happy to see people in the halls again. I think Ross did a great job. I think Ross Davies, I think the Radio Days people do a great job. It is certainly a cut above any recent CMW Radioactive. I'm glad they're trying to draw an international audience. I actually think it needs to be more Canadian. I am more excited by seeing Canadian programmers center stage than I am by seeing European or U.S. consultants at this thing, who aren't necessarily draws either. But I enjoyed it. I think it's headed in the right direction. I am certainly doing everything I can to help them get the word out to American programmers. This is, a good successor to the NAB radio show, which I miss.
And I'm glad you raised that, because there's very few programming conferences or sessions left. We had the disappearance of the Worldwide Radio Summit and now the All Access Audio Summit. That's obviously not going to be taking place in the future. Conclave has gone away. It feels like there's not a lot of places for programmers to get together and to have great conversations.
It's sad watching legendary stations shut down. It's sad watching legendary broadcasters retire or pass away, and it's sad that there's less infrastructure for the industry, and All Access is a part of that. All Access, had a lot to do with keeping the record and radio relationship in play, and I worry about what's going to happen without it. Right. We are already at this point where labels don't seem to want to promote records to radio. They want TikTok to be the decider, and they'll come to radio once a month with something. And I'm not seeing that as a good situation for anybody, including artists, including the labels themselves. We have half the hits we had 3 years ago, and that was the pandemic year when we were talking about how nobody was releasing any records. Now we have half of those. I'm not sure how that's better. But yes, I miss All Access. I never got to go to a Worldwide Radio Summit in person. Certainly as a website, I am hoping that Radio Insight, where my columns appear, will be a resource to even more people now and help facilitate dialogue and be the place where people see ratings.
So I always thought this podcast would be a great place for record companies to spend money to play a new song and get the song into the ears of programmers. I've had maybe one or two little nibbles of some indie promoters who would make that podcast advertising purchase. But as I found out at Radio Days North America, and I spoke to record reps, we're not doing that anymore. And then comes a note from Joel Denver about the prevailing headwinds and that money kind of drying up. So what are the record companies doing? Are they really going to double down on TikTok and that's it?
I think there's some disappointment with TikTok, but I don't know what's replacing it. There are articles in Billboard, including today, about how labels don't find TikTok to be promotable and how TikTok is playing less music and feeding people less music. But I don't see anything else replacing it. And every now and then, it helps with a record that radio can play anyway, like Noah Kahan, Dial Drunk. This week, there's a record called Lil Boo Thing by Paul Russell, which samples Best of My Love by The Emotions, and that song is being reinforced by TikTok, and it's a pretty good radio record. But, every now and then, just as often, you get a song with a title I can't even repeat here, and radio doesn't know what to do with it.
What happened to all the hits?
People have busy lives. They can't do radio's job and the record companies and break them all. Occasionally they can find something and share it with friends. Occasionally something can become phenomenal on its own. Occasionally something that has the help of 5 years of TV commercials like Makiba by Jane that got a bounce back this summer. Occasionally a record like that can come back, and it's usually not organic anyway. It's usually TV or movies or some sort of calculated effort. And the result is we have half the hits we used to have. We have half the hits we had even 3 years ago. The consultant Gaius Apollyon keeps a list of how many powers there were at Top 40 every year. And in 2020, which was certainly a slow year, there were about 30. This year, they're going to be about 20, if we're lucky, maybe 18.
So I always thought that for a song to be a hit, it just had to get above 40 in the charts. At least that's what the CRTC was telling me for many years on how to score, what a hit is. So how does somebody like Guy determine what a hit is?
I think from everything I've learned doing the column I call Lost Factor and also working in radio, I think something really has to go to power, which means top 10, top 5, these days, top 3, to be a record everybody knows and everybody remembers. And the old hit non-hit rule, 40 is certainly not the dividing line anymore. A song can go top 15, and you can't be sure everybody will have heard it. But, even then, with hit non-hit, there were some fun loopholes. Here Comes the Sun, never a single, non-hit. The Beatles and Tony Sheridan doing My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean got up to 20-something, I think, maybe 32 at the height of Beatlemania. That's a hit. Somebody would be dinged if they went to 50.1% playing that song. And yet, most people don't even know it exists unless you live through Beatlemania.
Hit non-hit. May it be the last time we talk about it on this podcast, and may it rest in peace.
It kept things interesting, and maybe not in a good way. And you talk about the endurance of records. there were, toward the end, plenty of good non-hits. What I Like About You, I Melt With You, things that peaked at 42. And then there were things like The Edge of Heaven by Wham, which nobody would even remember if it weren't for non-hit. So it just shows how songs don't endure equally.
Or unless, of course, you've seen the Wham documentary, which was phenomenal.
Wham documentary was phenomenal, but, for all the great songs they had on the radio, it's mostly Careless Whisper and Wake Me Up. And for the phenomenal album that George Michael had, it's mostly Faith and Father Figure.
I think one thing about that documentary that amazed me was just how short the radio window was with Wham, where it kind of starts with Wake Me Up Before You Go, and it's done just a little bit after Freedom in 1985. And also it's surrounded by some of the best music ever created for radio. It's a short, wild ride.
Well, and it was an embarrassment of riches if, George wanted to make a different corner or later playing for Time, something that wasn't a fun radio record. Radio would find another fun radio record. They didn't have to deal with it. It's interesting now in this era of Jake Goldenhour and Steven Sanchez and Billie Eilish and so many records that are atmospheric and ethereal and not fun and up-tempo. It's interesting to think that some of George Michael's more experimental songs could have been bigger hits now.
Yeah, and I too am thinking about that 1989 album or the 1990 album as well, which Listen Without Prejudice, which we all did.
Yeah, well, people tried to like that record and radio tried to like it. And for a couple of years, he didn't want to be a rock star. And for a couple of years, Alanis didn't want to be a rock star. And, that's, how he got supposed former. Eventually, they all came back and wanted to be rock stars again. And by then, radio had other choices.
So we're talking about the lack of hits this summer, but I look back and I read your columns all the time and I'm thinking that it was 1984 was really peak hits, the most punch, the most superstardom. Am I right to say that was the one? That was the year where every song was really can't miss?
Yeah, I've just written a column about whether 83 or 84 was better. And there are partisans for both. Certainly, 83 has a pretty clear winner for Song of the Summer in Every Breath You Take. 84, is it When Doves Cry? Is it Dancing in the Dark? Is it Ghostbusters? Could be Round and Round by Rat. There were so many choices and so many fun up-tempo records. Was it The Warrior? There were so many things, and all of them sound like they would be much bigger than a lot of what's out now.
As we record this, is late August, and I think back to 1984, and the song that really sort of captured a couple weeks right around now was Tina Turner and What's Love Got to Do with It. I can pretty much parcel and segment each one of those songs that you mentioned by week throughout June, July, and August. The correct answer, by the way, is 1984. I enjoyed 1983 as much as anyone else. Somebody on Twitter responded 1985, which was a big mistake.
Yeah.
Although, listen, Power of Love from Huey Lewis and the News was a great summer song from 1985.
1985 loses points for Broken Wings. And I know some people love that song, but that to me is, the beginning of the descent back into yacht rock.
Something else about 1985, when I go over it, I look at the charts and especially AOR charts, and it's really the number of epic bands, Fleetwood Mac, Eagles, Paul Rodgers is releasing a record. Everybody who was successful in the 70s is now releasing solo records into 1985, and it's just a factory of music coming at us from multiple formats.
And they've all listened to each other. It's like 1967 with Beach Boys, Motown, Dylan, Beatles, Stones, all playing off each other. In 1984, Springsteen gets remixed by Arthur Baker, and all of the music sort of meets in this, this place that isn't rock, isn't pop, isn't R&B, and is all of the above.
Do you have one song that you will look at throughout the history of all summers and say that is the quintessential summer song? So when you go to look at this year in 2023, you will compare it against another song from another era.
1976, Thin Lizzy, Boys Are Back in Town. Up, fun, propulsive, little bit edgy, about summer.
How would you put Cruel Summer from Bananarama?
Cruel Summer, 1983 in the UK, 1984 in North America. Cruel Summer is certainly up there. Until this summer, I would have dinged points for the title, but it's not a stopper this year, obviously.
It feels like a lonely song as well.
This summer, it's Taylor Swift Cruel Summer, because Taylor was pretty much the only shared experience that everybody had. And it could have been Karma. It could have been Cruel Summer. I went for the song with summer in the title, and I went for the one that's a hit now as opposed to 6 weeks ago. It also says something about Taylor that she's the only person who had 2 hits this summer, because songs hang around forever.
That's come up a couple of times, that the lack of hits is really the result of fewer shared experiences.
And vice versa. Fewer chances for people to unite around a record.
How's the music industry going to solve that? Or are they just going to carry on?
I first have to recognize it as a problem. I think the music industry has found a model with streaming that makes money, but it doesn't necessarily make stars. And there's still layoffs in the music industry. And there are still artists, on Twitter complaining about getting $27 royalty checks. So it's not like this is working so outrageously well for everybody that we don't need radio in the equation.
Why Taylor Swift? Is it timing because of when she started and the genres that she touched way back, before 2010, and now it's evolved in this direction? What is it that has made her as big as the Beatles?
She did make her superstardom with radio at a time when radio had clearly had the yank. She happens to be, the last brand name artist of that magnitude. And I think the fact that she was kind of off the radio for a couple of years, people thought she was going to have a traditional Celine Dion type arc and reach the point where she just never became cool again and didn't have hits again. And I couldn't be happier for her that turned out not to be the case. And I think it's a good message to radio not to be too snobby about any artist. And also, as far as fans, whatever frustrations they had trying to get tickets, Taylor has been all about goodwill to the fans and good vibes at a time when other things aren't.
I also think back to a moment in the documentary that she was in where she wanted to take a stand against, I think it was a Republican candidate who was running. The issue eludes me at this time, but she was going to take a political stand, and there are people around her saying, this is not a good idea. This is going to sort of rupture your fan base. And it seemed to have done the opposite and galvanized fans even closer. And I'm not sure I'm not even sure which one of her fans would even depart, because I don't think that she was alienating anybody, really. She was galvanizing them.
It's certainly something we barely even remember now. Plus, it was not a national election about which she, made a point of being silent. It was a Tennessee state election or, a Tennessee senatorial election.
Sound Off Podcast supports Podcasting 2.0, so feel free to send us a boost if you're listening on a newer podcast app. If you don't have a newer podcast app, you can get one at newpodcastapps.com.
So one of the things that you do all the time is schedule music. And I think one of the questions I always love to ask is, tell me about how music scheduling has evolved in the last 10 years, but I'm not going to make you do that because it's changed so much in the last 3 years or 2 years. So what are some of the new techniques for music scheduling when we're dealing with less hits, when we're dealing with TikTok, when we're, getting our music from different places? How would I schedule music on a radio station these days?
I am still dealing mostly with gold-based stations, so I don't have to worry about 3 Justin Biebers an hour. I still believe that program directors have thrown up their hands on some things that still do matter to the audience. When Post Malone had 3 hits at once, I was working at my Edison research office, and there were 3 interns, all of them CHR listeners, women in their 20s, and they were working, at adjacent desks. And I listened to an hour of a top 40 station that played 3 Post Malone songs, and then I switched to their competition, and I heard 3 more Post Malone songs, and I said, how did you feel about the Post Malone? I mean, he's hot, right? You probably enjoyed hearing him 6 times, and they said, no, it was too much. Program directors don't want to fight that battle anymore, and they have certainly positioned it as a get off my lawn issue. If you object to any artist every 20 minutes, it's your problem and not the audience's. But I think the audience wants variety. I think the audience wants a variety of textures. I think the audience doesn't want 2 songs to sound the same. And I don't think the audience wants to hear Harry Styles as it was in power rotation for 2 years. I don't think people want to hear Calm Down as much as they love it in power rotation for a year. People aren't saying, when you look at the call out and nothing replaces Calm Down, I don't interpret that as I cannot get enough of this song and I want to hear it every 65 minutes for 2 years. I interpret it as I have not learned any other songs, in part because you don't play any other songs, and it's not that I'm not sick of this song. I'm just sick of other things less.
I know you threw the disclaimer in that says, oh, I just do the classic hit stuff, but you're not bulletproof from outside sources changing things on you. I've got 2 examples that have come to mind. One of them is Kate Bush, Running Up That Hill, which doesn't even get played on a lot of classic hit stations. And then all of a sudden it's going up top 40. So classic hits has to react to that as well.
Classic hits could do well to look at what's around it. Not everything is going to stick. It's looking like Kate Bush might not stick. And it probably doesn't help having it 7 times a day on the radio. When songs would come back into the public consciousness, it would be something like Unchained Melody that you hadn't heard for years, and it would come back on as a current for 4 months, and then be a gold again. And certainly Unchained Melody did stay relevant for many, many years. I don't know that every song that comes back from a TV series is going to have sustained relevance. I also think there are songs that are bigger than people realize. Jolene by Dolly Parton is a song every 25-year-old knows. They probably don't know what it's from. They probably don't think of it as classic country because they don't listen to classic country for the most part. That's a song that could be on a lot more classic hit stations. And it's interesting. Some of the stations I work with, it just sounds so weird to even suggest it. I have one client where I know I'm hearing them groan every time I bring it up. It's practically like a drinking game that Sean will at some point in the conference call bring up Jolene.
Yeah, I think we had a rock cousin to that, Johnny Cash, Hurt. That's another one that rock stations even found their way playing at one point.
Yeah, and I don't know if a classic hit station should play that, but it would still test for any alternative station that tested it.
Yeah, and another song that did find its way back, and again, these TV shows are on demand. They are not shared experiences. They're not mass shared experiences, say the way The Sopranos was, which had Journey, Don't Stop Believing, at the end of it. Or like Glee, which had Journey, Don't Stop Believing, as a part of the repertoire. But something as simple as Linda Ronstadt in The Last of Us doing Long, Long Time. I didn't even watch the show, but the song was on and somebody in the room was watching it. And I began to sort of touch and feel it again. It didn't have a giant resurgence, but it certainly got a couple weeks of interest.
Yeah, and I haven't had an opportunity yet to see if that song took in radio research. And, it's a good example because there's going to be one of those every few weeks now. And which ones are going to stay with people? And by the way, if I had tested Long, Long Time 6 months ago or a year ago, it was a great song then, great song now, but 9 months ago, people wouldn't have remembered it. It wouldn't have been top of mind for them. It would have been a programmer's self-indulgence to even consider playing it on the radio again. As somebody who works with classic hit stations, I do like to surprise and delight. But, there are 15,000 hits that don't generally get airplay now. And which ones do you start without some outside help?
Something that I've been interested in tracking, and that's the launch of a couple of radio stations that have not performed as well as I thought. And, the first one, it was in Edmonton. It was now at 102.3. I was really surprised it wasn't copied more across the country in, the 2010s, but, some budgetary restrictions as it was. But, eventually a couple stations did come around and relaunch, one in Winnipeg at 94.3 and I believe one in Toronto at 93.5. And, it's Today FM, Now Radio, join the conversation. And they haven't taken off the way I thought they would have. What do you think and why is that?
Edmonton and Calgary, they have, a 15-year head start and a 10-year head start. Edmonton certainly had one of the best and best financed launches of all time, which stays with us to this day. And again, if they're not the answer, it is certainly hard to build a full-service radio station from scratch in Vancouver, in Winnipeg, certainly in Toronto. It's hard to get noticed now when you're not dealing with as many potential listeners to begin with, and it's hard to get noticed now unless you're spending Rolco 2005 money. All of that said, One, I hear the influence of that station practically everywhere in Canadian radio. Anytime somebody does a phone's topic, I hear that influence. The other thing that's interesting, I still hear, compared to America, I hear a lot more topical magazine type item topics, surveys, and now FM type topics. And I think some of that in Canada is the lingering effect of the enrichment regulations that went away 25 years ago, where people had to come up with topical bits like that. I feel some of that lives on in stations like Now FM, especially when they do "What's your favorite cookie?" or should ham be a pizza topping?
I think I took a podcast episode to really bang on a lot of stations where everybody was sort of doing it and meeting in the middle, and it would be a meme and it would be something you would create on Canva and post it on your Facebook page. And this is what we're talking about. And do raisins belong in cookies? And I criticized a lot of stations for doing it. You did message me and say, the join the conversation format is very valid. It does very well. And I would expect to hear that sort of conversation on that station. I don't expect to hear it on 10 different radio stations.
Yeah, I think people want to be engaged, and the engagement is different. Look at Ken Bruce in the UK. Everybody else on Radio 2 did pineapple on pizza, except for the topical, political show at middays. But mostly, he talks about music, and it's refreshing to hear people talk about music. And it's interesting, if you listen to C97.7 in Calgary, there's obviously a certain amount, because they're co-owned with the Join the Conversation stations. There is certainly some of that in their DNA, but when you hear Graham Buchanan do his breaks, the structure is familiar, but the topic is music. Graham did a break yesterday where he said, "I suppose you're wondering what the best Britney Spears song is," and then went cold into "You Drive Me Crazy." I thought that was a great break because it got people's attention about a topic that anybody who'd be listening to that station had an opinion on.
If I had more time in my life, I would probably figure out a way to run the data and find out what the lost classics were, but you've done all the work for us all, so thank you very much. First off, what is a lost classic, and how do you sort of determine what they are?
Back in the 80s, a DJ in Boston came up with a show called Lost 45s, and what he was playing at that point was Seasons in the Sun, and Heartbeat is a Love Beat, and all the records that people profess to be ashamed of. So a guy named Barry Scott came up with the lost concept. What I do is called the lost factor, and what I do is I take how big a song was when it was a hit based on how well it did on the year-end charts. And I divide it by the number of spins it gets now. And I did that for about 3 years, starting in 2020 until I worked up to about 2009. And that's where I've stopped it for the time being. And what you find, of course, songs do not endure equally. The famous example is that Don't Stop Believin' ends up on Glee, ends up on The Sopranos, and becomes a song for our time. And Physical by Olivia Newton-John, with 10 weeks on at number one when Don't Stop Believin' was a hit, does not endure the same way. If you look at classic hits radio, Olivia Newton-John is pretty much represented by one song from Grease, which has the help of everyone watching it when they're 10. So if you're interested, I've looked at literally every hit from 1960 to 2009 and how much you hear them or don't hear them on the radio now. Just Google Radio Insight Lost Factor, and then Sean, S-E-A-N, and you should find those articles. And for the people who liked it, it's a definite rabbit hole. So do it when you've got some time on the weekend.
I mean, I've lost complete days down there. And I think so often about, again, 84 and 85, when I did a lot of radio listening. And, a song, I think it was Olivia Newton-John, Twist of Fate, a big one from 1984, very lost, but, big video with John Travolta from a movie. The formula's there. It's a very simple ad, and it's certainly going to get lost in and amongst everything else in 84. And so many songs by Hall & Oates in the years afterwards also became lost.
Yeah, there was a definite bias, and I think Jack and Bob had something to do with this, the Jack and Bob FM stations, toward things that were new wave, toward things that were rock, and away from things that were pop. Twist of Fate seemed like as big a hit at the time as anything else. And so did Far From Over by Frank Stallone. It's, if you want to get into the weeds, why did Maniac by Michael Cimbello last and not Far From Over? They're practically the same song.
I guess it would probably horrify you to let you know that I watched Flashdance for the very first time about 6 weeks ago on a VHS tape.
You can also, by going to Ross on Radio on Spotify, you can find my 1983 playlist. And there are 4 songs from Flashdance on there, not just the singles. So
that came up when I was watching the show. Oh, I forgot about that. Oh, I forgot about that. That was also a hit.
Yeah, guys our age, Manhunt by Karen Kamen is probably a song we've all heard 100 times, but never on the radio.
Sean, thanks so much for doing this and being on the podcast yet again.
Always great to be here.
I always get so much reaction to this episode, and so nice many people listen to it twice. So thanks very much for being on again.
Thank you. And, thanks to everybody who's a fan of the column, who's kept us going into the 12th or 13th year of Ross on Radio. So I appreciate it.
The Sound Off Podcast is written and hosted by Matt Kundle. Produced by Evan Serminski. Edited by Chloe Emo Lane. Social media by Aiden Glassy. Another great creation from the Sound Off Media Company. There's always more at soundoffpodcast.com.